Welcome to the Definitive Poker Bankroll Workshop. If you don't already know me, my name is Blake Eastman, and I briefly wanted to explain to you exactly where this information is coming from and why I'm qualified to discuss live bankroll management. So for the past decade, I have been coaching every aspect of live no limit hold'em at the School of Cards, the first brick and mortar poker school in the country, which is now fully online. In poker, I am probably most known for Beyond Tells, which is the largest behavioral study ever conducted on poker players, in addition to the most extensive behavioral-based training available. I was also an adjunct psychology professor at the City University of New York, and I own a behavioral research company called the Nonverbal Group. So, one of the things you are going to quickly notice about us here at School of Cards is there is more of a focus around the psychological factors and bigger picture factors involved in poker. And it's one of the reasons I take a completely different approach towards teaching and helping players understand bankroll management and the larger planning aspects of live poker. Now, the first thing that I want to make very clear is that the information I am going to go over in this workshop comes from my experience helping poker players of every single level and background for the past decade. One of the things I love to do is track, so a lot of my recommendations come from the tracking and analysis we have done to determine what really works and what doesn't work with the people who take our online courses, our private clients, and the people in our professional groups. So that being said, I want to point out a couple of things before we start. So first, this workshop is for live no limit hold'em players. While it will be helpful to anyone who plays poker, the examples I use will all be from live no limit hold'em. I will not be discussing online poker or other variations of the game. Second, this is for educational purposes only, and the hourly rates and win rates featured in this workshops are the result of a massive amount of work and dedication to this game. Please, 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 please be responsible when making decisions around finances, but more on this later. Third, I'm going to be going over a ton of content in this workshop, and by the end, you will have a significantly deeper understanding of bankroll management, and this series is really going to help you see poker from a different perspective. And hopefully you're going to begin to understand the bigger picture aspect of this game, which is something many players just do not understand today. So at the end of this workshop, if we don't cover something, you will get the opportunity to ask a question and we will answer it. We just want you to have a deeper foundational understanding before getting into your specific questions, okay? So it's just important that you make it through the entire workshop because you're going to learn a ton. So before we jump into bankroll management and the critical aspects of poker, I just want to make a couple of points. So first, poker, and more specifically, advice on strategy is highly relative. Tens of thousands of people will watch this video. And while there will definitely be overlap and some of you will be similar, you need to consider multiple factors when taking advice in this game and making decisions about your involvement and improvement with poker. And this is why, any poker bankroll maxim, for example, you need to play with 1% of your roll, or 30 buy-ins is a good amount for 1-2. Any sort of blanketed statement shows a fundamental lack of understanding of what it means to have a cohesive strategy towards being successful in this game. And here's why. The definition of success and how much work, time, and risk is involved in getting there is going to change from person to person. So when someone asks me the question, how much what should my bankroll be at 1-2? How could I actually give solid advice? I need to know the reality of their situation, which is the second point. This is the key word we're going to operate from, which is reality. This workshop will act as a massive reality check, so you need to understand exactly what is realistic or not when it comes to your goals and ambitions in this game. It will also pull all the information that is required to make an intelligent plan for bankroll management to the surface. Now, that being said, I have worked with literally thousands of poker players, and most think they need to read a certain book, understand a certain concept, worked on tilt. No, you just need, if you're not meeting your goals or your definition of success in this game, you are making one of two foundational mistakes. Either you aren't good enough to be profitable, or you are good enough to be profitable, but you aren't adjusting to the current financial situation at the table. Let me explain. There is a baseline level of understanding and skill that you need in order to be able to beat today's games. If you haven't reached a certain level, then no amount of advice on tilt, emotional regulation, or even bankroll is going to save you. If you can't make profitable decisions at the table, you will lose money over time. That's just the reality. Also, I want you to understand that you are never done with working on your game. This game takes consistent work, and if you don't stay up to date with the improvements and current thinking of the game, you simply get left behind. However, some of you have done enough damn work on your game. It's now time to actually profit, to actually make some money and work on attaining a higher hourly rate while playing. And I know some of you are watching this going, how do I know what the reality is? We are going to handle that in a couple of minutes. But first, let's talk about playing a situationally based approach. So here's the problem. When I say situational or adjustment, most poker players are going to think I mean in-game adjustments. But the reality is your situation isn't just who you are playing with, it's you. It's your strengths and weaknesses, your goals, and most importantly, your bankroll. For example, let's say you are a highly competent poker player and you have a 10 buy-ins at 1-2. Not much of a bankroll, but you want to run it up and you want to make damn well sure that you don't bust that roll. There's a style that you need to play in order to decrease the variance associated with the lines that you're taking. That style requires you to prey on other players' big mistakes and often leave some value on the table to reduce your risk. You might be in a specific spot on the flop where you're ahead of your opponent's range, but this is the kind of player who is going to call light and be tricky to play against, and you aren't sure where you're at right there, so you just might want to check fold, because you don't really want to take a marginal hand to the river and have a 10% hit to your bankroll, even though it might have been the right decision over the long run in terms of an EV perspective. This is why so much poker advice is ultimately bad. It's not grounded in the reality of your situation. You're allowed to take suboptimal or lower EV lines in order to accomplish your goals. For some players, this type of grind is not worth it, and sometimes I find myself telling people, listen, take an extra shift at your job, grind this roll up so you could actually play the highly exploitive style of poker you want to play. But ultimately, this is a personal choice. I can't tell you how many times someone has sent me a hand and said, tell me, Blake, what did I do? Did I do the right thing? Did I play it right? So on and so forth. And well, sometimes the answer is definitely no. And sometimes it's yes. But a lot of the time, I don't really know until I understand the reality of your situation. Poker players just do not get this. They read books, they watch YouTube videos, and they copy how other players think, when in reality, it's not right for their situation. Also, your individual situation doesn't just come down to your bankroll. It's also about emotion, fatigue, cognition, and a lot more. Sometimes get emails from players who complain about running bad, yet the hand they sent me isn't necessarily a bad play. It's just ultimately unnecessary for where they are in their game, and they would have been just much better off just folding pre. As someone who has been coaching for so long, this is the greatest piece of wisdom I can share with you. Please don't make the mistake of playing when you are not equipped to make profitable decisions, and make sure you understand the reality of your situation so you can play a style that works for you. This concept is at the very core of bankroll management. And now I'm going to show you exactly how to establish a bankroll and a plan and make this all work. And in order to do that, we're going to ask ourselves 5 key questions that will allow us to establish the reality of our situation. I'm going to go over each of them in detail because I want you to be able to do this multiple times throughout your poker career. When we are done with this, I'll go over some case studies to explain what I would recommend for various answers to the questions, and answer a bunch of various questions that you have about bankroll and hourly rate and variance and all that. Okay, so the first question is, what is your past performance? Past performance is the best predictor of future performance, so we need to know this. These are the cold, hard facts, your raw numbers. We need to know the amount of time you spent at the table and your profits and losses so we can calculate your hourly rate. When discussing past performance, players use vague terminology like, I think I'm winning, or I'm sort of winning, which honestly isn't going to cut it in this game. You need to know your numbers. For example, this is an acceptable answer to the question, what is your past performance? It is highly detailed and grounded in reality, and the information is what we need in order to actually make informed decisions about our bankroll. If you can't get exact numbers, which most of you can't, you need to come up with the bare minimum, how much money you have made or lost approximately over how many hours. Also, I recommend after this video, look in the links that we send you and make sure you take the tracking workshop if you're not actually doing that right now. The second question is, what work have you put into your game? Making consistent money from poker is not as easy as it was 10 years ago. I honestly have been shocked how players will discuss starting a bankroll and playing more seriously when they have only read 2 books on poker. It takes a lot of off-table work to develop a consistent on-table thought process. After coaching for so long, I really don't believe in the concept of raw poker talent. There is a certain amount of concepts and application that just needs to be learned. Not to mention, doing it on your own is a massive waste of time. This is an example of an answer to that question. It's not much, but it's detailed enough to get a sense of how this level of work is going to compare to what I think is required to actually be winning at certain levels. It's also just important to really understand how much time, money, and effort you've dedicated to this game, which you can do by answering that question. The third question is, what are your actual goals with poker and what does your timeline look like? For example, Blake, I want to make an average of about $1,000 plus playing 40 hours a week. I would like to accomplish this goal by January 1st, 2018. Don't hold back here. It's important to get that number down because we can determine if your goal is actually in reality, something so many players don't do. The fourth question is, what is the realistic income situation? This is a really important question, and it's not as easy as you think to answer because it's often flexible. You might have a 2K set aside, but your work bonus is coming up and soon that'll be 3K, or you might have some consistent money in on the side. We will deal with all the complications, but the real question is, how much money do you have right now to dedicate to poker? Also, I don't have any is a fine answer as well. There are paths for that also. It's just always about acknowledging your reality. If you have a family responsibility, it's only $500 to your name for your pocket, that's fine. Just get that number down. The final question is definitely my favorite. It's what is your gamble or risk factor? This is a complicated one, but basically, how okay are you with losing the above money? For example, I have 5K, and if I lose it, I won't be happy, but I could rebuild it fairly quickly. Or I made a deal with my wife that I would invest 5K, and if I lost it all, I would just basically stop playing poker for good. These two situations or risk profiles may make the level of aggression involved completely different. So you are going to find that a lot of your bankroll management problems stem from the way you answer this. A lot of players will be like, well, I don't care if I lose a buy-in at 1-2, which is why they make dumb mistakes at 1-2 and consistently lose buy-ins over and over again. We will take the answers and discussions around these 5 questions and use them to help us create a plan, one that is grounded in reality and one that will work. The number one reason that players don't accomplish their goals in this game is because they don't have an actual plan. Bankroll management is essentially the foundation of that plan. It's a strategy for approaching the game with a certain amount of capital, right? And it's the systems that you put in place to reach your goals in poker. That being said, you want to be realistic, or else you just keep saying, I'm busting my bankroll and over again, or it's going to take me 50, 30 years to move up in stakes. I just don't want you to fall into this trap, which is why we are going to learn to build a solid bankroll management plan in this workshop. But now, to make this point, I want to show you 3 different people and 3 different situations and the plans I would recommend for each of them. But first, we need to discuss a couple of more critical elements that you need to factor in when discussing bankroll. The first is variance. Variance is a reality of the game. You can't fight it. It's at the foundation of poker. If you can't accept the ups and downs in poker, if you can't accept the concept that you're making a decision that has long-term profits and you may not profit from it right then and now, you shouldn't be playing poker. Sometimes players just don't understand that concept, just don't want to accept that concept, and they want every single session to be a winning session. If that's what you want, you need to change your mindset, or you need to play a different game, because there's no escaping variance, okay? Second, players aren't really connected to the reality of variance. It's kind of like death. Most people at a younger age aren't connected to the reality of death. An average 25-year-old or 30-year-old person is not thinking about dying. However, when we get in later stages of life, those concepts start to come up. Same thing about variance. People just don't think it exists sometimes when mapping things out, which is why a lot of players say oh, I have 5 buy-ins and I'm going to run that up. Well, yeah, it's possible, but more than not likely, if you get hit with a little downswing of variance, you're screwed. So you need to understand that. And also, most of the time, variance is used as a complete excuse, okay? So most of the time, players are making mistakes because they aren't implementing the strategy we discussed about. They don't know the reality of their situation, and they're not playing a situational-based style of poker. And they blame everything on variance. So, I got to the river and this is what happened. When the reality is, based on their situation, they shouldn't have even been in the hand. And that's why you see players will play with poker range calculators and kind of type in their equity and go, oh my God, I win 95% of the time. I can't believe I'm so unlucky, blah, blah, blah. But you shouldn't have even been in the hand. So the mistake was earlier. And that's something that's really, really, really interesting. Now, variance must be accounted for and integrated into a live poker player's strategy, right? So this is something that we're considering, we're thinking about. In order to do this, I want to show you this quick chart. Okay, so this chart is just a simple explanation of the amount of hands you see in live poker. So on top is the hours played, below is the hands played, and then finally your range. So for example, if somebody's playing 1,000 hours of poker, and we see on average 25 hands per hour, which is kind of like an average for a casino, we see 25,000 hands, right? But we see 25,000 hands, but you're really not playing 25,000 hands because for the most part, you're folding. So let's say you're playing 10% of your range, you're only, seeing actually 2,500 hands. Now let's look at the lower side of this. This was always interests me. Let's look at the 50 side. Players will say like, oh, I profited, Blake, I'm doing well. I played 50 hours of poker. If you played 50 hours of poker and you're a pretty tight player and you're playing 10% of hands, that means you've only seen 125 hands. Out of those 125 hands, maybe like 10 have made it to the river, 20 have made it to the turn, and the rest were like flop or pre-flop fold. You don't really understand how good a player is. You can't establish win rates at that number because it's just not that much frequency. Look at this, 94, 125, even playing 25% in 50 hands, it's a little bit more, but it's not that much. Which is also one of the reasons why if you're trying to calculate and see if you're actually successful or not, or trying to better understand your hourly rate, the more aggressive you are, the easier the number is, right? So listen, if somebody's playing a winning poker player over 1,000 hours and they're playing 25% of their range, that's 6,000 instances of them making decisions. So we can draw more conclusions from that. And a lot of players don't have a large enough data set in order to make an informed decision about whether they're profitable or not in poker. Which takes me to my next chart, an explanation of hourly rates in live no limit hold'em. So on the top we have descriptors, good, great, and exceptional. And then we have big blinds per hour. So big blinds per hour is just a standard measure to use how much you're making in a particular game. So like 3 to 6 is I consider good, 6 to 12 I consider great, and exceptional is 12 plus. Now these are obviously very loose kind of numbers. I mean, you can make an argument that 7 is still on the lower side of great. Like, we don't want to get too specific here, but it's just important to establish reality that, if you're doing 12 plus big blinds per hour over a large sample size, you are all intents and purposes crushing that game. 50 hands is not a large sample size, okay? It needs to be considerable amount of hours, right? Like 500, 600, 700 in live poker, and you have to consider your style when factoring in those variables. But this is just like a good standard. Now the reality is most players watching this video over time, if we actually look at the raw numbers, are probably nowhere near this chart. You're probably not profitable. I mean, that's just the distribution of poker players. The fact that you're watching poker material maybe will skew it over, but I really believe that over the long run, most players are losing players. Also, most players are losing players when it comes to this bankroll management and all this stuff because of something else. This chart, or that chart I previously showed you, does not include other factors like the rake. It does not include the transportation that it takes to get to a casino. If it takes you 3 hours to get to a casino and you got to stay there and you factor in your hourly rate, you're probably not really making that much money. So it's really important to take a look at those factors to do what I think is the most important, and it's my next concept, Blake's hourly utility principle. Now, what basically this means is that the hourly rate that you're striving to achieve needs to give you some sort of utility, both financially and from a happiness perspective. You need to feel proud of it. And the reason why is it's very rare that people make it long term with like a stable hourly rate. Like, let's say somebody's making $8 an hour. Usually the best thing to do is compare your hourly rate at your job or what you do for a living to your poker hourly rate. So if somebody makes $150 an hour at their job, let's say somebody makes, let's not get carried away, let's say somebody makes like $44 at their job, and they'd be happy making $20 an hour at poker, but they wouldn't be so happy making 6 or 7. We can use that math to figure things out. So sometimes players study the game so much, they get really good, but they only have a certain amount of capital. And I'm like, listen, if you just save up from your actual job, your hourly rate is higher so that we can get you into a higher game, and then it makes sense. A lot of people don't look at the pragmatic aspect of it, especially live players, because live players don't usually put in a considerable level of volume. That's just the reality. There's a loss that is required to get you to a casino, to get you to a home game. They don't happen that much. Game selection, there's all these different factors that don't make it so easy to actually play poker. So you need to understand what hourly rate is comfortable for you, what hourly rate you like. Sometimes players will say like, Blake, I need an hourly rate of like $300 an hour. I'm like, well, good luck, buddy, because that's just in the pretty much highest cash games in the world, and you won't have access to those games. And sometimes people are like, Blake, listen, I want to be able to just get like a $10 to $15 hourly rate at 1-2 and slowly build that roll up to 2-5. What's my path? How do I get there? And I'm like, all right, amazing. I can show you that. I can teach you a foundational style. I can get you in the game. We can do all those factors, but you got to be grounded in what that number is right for you. So you always want to be thinking and optimizing around hourly rate. It's something I'll get into a little bit later when it comes to tournament poker. But for now, I want to discuss the third element. The third element is not everyone needs a damn poker bankroll. There's a big difference between a poker bankroll and a poker budget. Knowing which one you have is really, really important because it prevents you from constantly busting your roll and coming up with this excuse that you just aren't making it when it was impossible to make it on that roll, even if you were playing the best damn poker in the world, because sometimes just variance happens. I'll show you what I mean, but first let's take a look at some case studies so I can show you how all this information comes together and what my recommendations are. Case study number 1 features John. His goal is to make consistent money playing poker, $2K a month. Reality, he's a losing player over 100 hours, both qualitatively and quantitatively. Wasn't positive, but has lost approximately $2,400 over 100 hours. Also, when I say qualitatively, he sent me a survey and he did a little evaluation that had me see how he's actually thinking about the game, and we reached a conclusion that qualitatively he's not a winning poker player. His bankroll is $1,000. His financial situation is he doesn't really rely on the money, but definitely doesn't want to lose it. So his risk level and gamble factor is low. Timeline for goal 3 months. So this is an example of someone who will never make it. This player has never been a winning player. They're not a winning player now. They practically have no bankroll, and they want to make $2K a month in 3 months. This is an example of the player who needs to take the first route. They need to focus on studying and working on their game to become consistently profitable before, going into all this discussion about bankroll and all that. They're not even in the conversation of bankroll. They need to sit back at the table, okay? Next is Michelle. Her goal is to play semi-pro, $4,000 a month, and she wants to do that in 80 hours. So the reality is she's qualitatively and quantitatively a winning poker player, both from a mindset and process perspective. She's making $23.40 an hour at 1-2 over 650 hours. Could be a little bit of run good. That's a very high hourly rate, but at the end of the day, if you're profitable at 650 hours, you're probably a good player. Also, this is where I make the adjustments when I read these players' submissions. So I'm like, all right, Michelle, do this assessment. She does the assessment, and I see how she thinks, and I kind of connect that thought process, and then I try to determine how much she's actually implementing that at the table. And if it's the case where she is, you could kind of say like, all right, yeah, you're definitely ready, or you're definitely a profitable player. And sometimes you see the opposite. Sometimes I see players that have really good hourly rates with like 200 hours, 100, 300 hours. They send you a hand, and it's like, I don't think this player knows how to play poker that much. So it goes both ways. But this player is crushing it and a very, very good player. Her role is 6K. Financial situation, she has a decent job and can afford to lose her bankroll, wants to accomplish her goal within the next couple of months. Risk level and gamble factor high. Timeline for goal, 2 months. Okay, so first here, we got a couple things. So first, she needs to make a $50 an hour, essentially, if she wants to make 80 hours. She's never going to be able to do that at 1-2 over a long period of time, which means she needs to play 2-5. So this is where all the discussions come up of like, what's the access like to 2-5? Players always forget this when making bankroll management plans. In some casinos, 2-5 is the high stakes game and it's never actually running. In other casinos, there's 6 or 7 tables of 2-5 nonstop. In some home games, they'll never jump up 1-2. In other home games, they'll jump up to 2-5. You always have to consider access. What is your access to those actual games when figuring out a plan? Because if she tells me, listen, there's only 1-2 in the neighborhood, then she's going to be screwed, and we have to kind of adjust her plan and adjust what she's doing. So don't forget that. Now, she has a decent job and can afford to lose her bankroll, and she's got a risk factor that's high. Now, this is where the questions come in for you. So first, I would ask her, if you want to play semi-professionally, and you have a 6K bankroll, like what's the deal? How much money is actually coming out of your roll? So how much money are you taking out of it? Meaning, is she, wants to play semi-pro, make $4,000 a month, and for the first 6 months she's taking all that money and putting it into her actual bankroll? Or is she just wants to make $4,000 a month to buy things or pay for things? Like, how does that actually work? And this is why knowing your bankroll number is so important. So if you have $6,000, like players will do this. Where they're like, oh, Blake, I have 6K. Actually, no, I have 10K. Actually, no, I have 2K. Actually, no, like pick the damn number. Because when you pick the number, you can operate from the number and make decisions against that number. It's really, really important that you do this. Now, for this kind of player, what I would recommend for the most part, since she has a high risk factor, high gamble factor, is we got to get her to the quickest way to play 2-5. So at this point, I'd probably tell her already to jump up. And some of you might be like, oh, it's crazy, Blake. She's got, only 12 buy-ins for 2-5. But look at her situation. She's got a risk level and gamble factor is that high. She wants to accomplish this goal in 2 months. She's not going to be able to do that at 1-2 for sure. So we need to take stabs here. So what I would do is kind of discuss her strategy for approaching 2-5, probably focus on some table selection, make sure she's sitting at a good table, and then kind of attack it and take stabs with some sort of stop loss, meaning she'll take some stabs at 2-5, but if her bankroll goes down to probably like $4,000, she'll have to drop back down to 1-2. And we sit back and forth and have this plan so that we can establish what's the most effective path to get for her to do that. You see why? I hope you're seeing why bankroll is just not such an easy thing. It's not just, have 30 buy-ins. Like for this player, it wouldn't make any sense because what if she's got a job where she's making a lot of money and she really wants to get to that 50 hourly rate to make it worth it? What if $23 an hour for her is getting her bored of poker and that's going to make her make mistakes? I mean, there's just so many factors that are involved here. But this is an example of someone who would really be good for, really, really be good for taking a shot and kind of trying to move up. Next, his case study number 3. I call this the trap. So let's listen to Casey. He wants to play professionally while in grad school, needs $200 and $250 a week for living expenses and cheap living expenses, can play 30 hours a week. Reality, qualitatively a winning mindset and process, but has very little table time, 80 hours at 1-2. His bankroll is $1,600. His financial situation is he doesn't have a job, would be quitting to play poker and still be in school. His risk level and gamble factor is low. Timeline for goal is immediate. So I call this the trap because a lot of players fall into this trap. They're the kind of player who sits, scours the internet for every single resource about poker, works on their game for like 2 years or something like that, gets pretty damn good off the table, but doesn't actually play poker because their financial situation doesn't allow them to do that. So they're playing like only 80 hours at 1-2. I mean, you could have ran you literally could have had 2 hands that you went all in with kings, someone else called with aces, you suck out on them, in 2 hands, and that accounts for the profit at 1-2, and you don't really know, all right? But this qualitative, he's a winning mindset, and he's got a really good process. He's a really good poker player. The problem is this dynamics of this situation does not work. He needs $250 a week for living expenses, and he can play 30 hours a week. He only has a $1,600 roll, okay? So let's say he buys in for a game for $200. I mean, if he loses 3 buy-ins, he's like hit his roll by like 40%. It's not the most responsible thing, and this is the problem. Let's say his hourly rate is around, let's say he's playing $20 an hour, right? And he's playing $20 an hour at 30 hours. So he's making $600, okay? He's taking $250 of that $600 and putting it back in his pocket, which makes sense, but it's going to make his roll grow so slowly. And then this is the most important thing. Risk level and gamble factor is so low. This is not how you do it, basically. So what I would tell this player is like, listen, you're qualitatively and you have a winning mindset and process, but you have very little table time. So I don't know your ability to actually implement these things. And this is also where things like emotional regulation and people's tilt factors. I mean, some people are really good players until they stay a little bit longer and then they go nuts and they start losing their entire roll. Like, these things are important to know when you're actually establishing a bankroll plan and moving and creating this dynamic. So basically, for this player, what I would tell them to do is, save up some money. So get that roll, work extra work in another job, do something else, and try to get that $1,600 up to $3,000, and then maybe take a stab at it. Now, to be fair, this is kind of my story, and I literally wouldn't be having this conversation with you. I definitely didn't follow my own advice. So at that time, I didn't really know what my advice was because I wasn't playing professionally. I hadn't gone through all the ups and downs. But I was the kind of player that had $1,000 to my name, would put it all on the table, bust. $1,000 to my name, put all on the table, bust. And the reason I took a major chance early on in my poker career, and I ran like God for one summer. I made a large amount of money, and then I realized that, you know what, I'm probably not as good as I thought I was, and I came back down and I did it the right way. And the reality is I don't think that I'm having this discussion with you right now if I didn't take that risk. I probably would have been like, enough with poker because I just was so volatile. And that's part of your bankroll plan, and that's part of where you want to be as a poker player. Also, everybody has completely different goals, ambitions, risk tolerance, all that stuff. And for me, it worked because I was okay with having those swings. For other players, they can't have that, which is why these case studies help us see that actual dynamic. Now, a couple more things before I get into some other stuff. First, tournaments versus cash games. Okay, so you need to understand that my background is cash games. I believe that tournaments aren't poker, they're just a different variation of poker. High stakes cash games, or cash games where people will have their own money in their pocket, is the real version of poker. That being said, I've made the transition to tournament poker. I love it. I'm currently traveling the world and playing a lot of tournaments, so I love tournament poker. Now, somebody once asked me, Blake, what's the best way to become a professional tournament poker player? I said, the best way to become a professional tournament poker player is to win a big tournament so you have a large amount of money to deal with that capital. There are realities of tournament poker that a lot of players don't understand. Some of your biggest fans, some of the people that you watch on poker, they only have 20% of themselves or 30% of themselves. And while they have $7 or $8 million in wins, they might only have an actual salary or actual yearly income of maybe 150 to 200K, because in order to play those games, they sell action. Now, the reason why at School of Cards we don't teach tournaments, the reason that we don't go over tournaments, is because I believe that at its core, tournaments are not profitable for most poker players. I call it a tournament trap. And the reason why is casinos. Casinos live, and this is live, not online. Casinos are incentivized to make money. They have, first, if you look at the buy-in versus entry fee of most low-stakes tournaments, it is god-awful. For example, like a $100 buy-in with a $30 entry fee, it's horrible. You're never going to be profitable at those numbers, right? Second, the structures are terrible. If we're looking to exploit our skill at the table, the structures are so poor that we don't have enough time to actually understand the dynamic of player read ranges, learn about players, and utilize our skill at the table. And then finally, and probably most importantly, there's a lot of variance in poker. Okay, so there's a lot of variance in tournament poker. So essentially what happens is, you play good poker for 7 or 8 hours and all of a sudden you get yourself down to a 50-50 and you lose. If you look at the tournaments that you're actually playing and you calculate the hourly rate of these like 100 or 150s or like $70 tournaments, it's usually very, 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 very small, which is why if you're building a bankroll, I am always going to get players to focus on cash games and use cash game profits to shot take and play tournaments. Also, another tip, when you play tournaments, you should be playing tournaments that have a high level of utility for you. So for example, if you, some of you like play tournaments where if you win like $1,000, $2,000, and it feels good, it feels great to get some experience and practice, that's all that. But you want to win in games that have life-changing money, because then the ROI is there to make it worth the time and effort to play those games. And some of those life-changing money tournaments are unfortunately, $500 or more, where they have bigger prize pools and enough to make a big and considerable difference. I do not believe that building a bankroll, you should be doing that through live tournaments, because for the most part, they're losing. You need to make sure that you're checking the structures of all the tournaments that you play. Most of the time, they suck, which is why I don't recommend tournaments for play. But that's for building a roll. If you want to enjoy poker, if you enjoy them, it's a different situation, right? You can, have a good time going to a casino once a month, play tournaments. It's completely different. I'm talking about building an actual sustainable bankroll. Second, let's talk shot taking. So shot taking is the practice of, say you're playing 1-2 and you have a $5,000 bankroll and you want to take a shot at 2-5. I am a strong believer in shot taking. Putting your entire bankroll on a table is not shot taking. It's just crazy. So if all of a sudden you only have like $1,000, if let's say you have $2,000, and you've been playing 1-2 and you turn that from like 1,500 to 2,000, you know what, I want to make this more aggressive. Let me play 2-5. Let me play 5-10. And you buy in for $2,000 at 5-10. That's not shot taking. It's just madness. I am always going to add in bankroll management plan, strategic shot taking. And the reason why is you should always feel what it's like to actually experience the stakes above you if you're striving to get there. And like, there's so many stories. There's one story with one of my private clients that sent me an email and he's like, Blake, you're gonna kill me. And I said, oh no, because this guy has an issue with not following bankroll management. And when we started our agreement, we were like, listen, you're not gonna go into the past. We have a structure, And he's like, there was a 5-10 game. I couldn't I couldn't help myself. I had to sit down. So then I was like, oh no. And I keep reading the email, And like the Gmail attachment wasn't refreshing. So then finally the Gmail attachment refreshes and the guy's sending back like at least $9,000 or $10,000 in chips. Like I had a good session. So that player took a risk and it was rewarded. But there's so many times where you do that and it doesn't work. You need to really figure out if you're willing to deal with that. And sometimes the best way to do this is through simple visualization. So you want to like close your eyes and think to yourself both the upside and downside and the reality of it. So like what happens right now if I have $2,000, I sit down at 510 and that, I turn that into 6K or I turn that into 4K. Let's say triple up or double up. How does that feel? And you process that, and then and see how that changes your financial situation. And then you also want to do the other side. What if I sit down in 2 hands, I lose my entire stack? How does that feel? And sometimes if the feeling is like, oh my God, I want to kill myself, this is crazy, I can't handle it, you shouldn't be taking that. It's not responsible. So you really need to make that individual decision and understand the dynamics of that. Just understand that at School of Cards, we have the motto of we never gamble. When you sit down at 510 and you only have, or 2-5, and you only have $500 or $1,000 to a name, you may not be gambling in terms of the EV decisions that you're making at the table. But if you expect to think that you're always going to walk away profitable or doubling up, you're essentially gambling. So I do not recommend that for most players. Third, what is required to play poker professionally? Now, so many players ask me this question. You need to understand that at School of Cards, I love poker, I love teaching poker. I think that poker as a profession is for a very small group of people, not just from skill set mentality, but from like want to sit down and play poker 30 to 40 hours a week for a long amount of time. I think most people are better designing a system around side income. So like striving to make an extra $1,000 a month playing poker or $2,000 a month playing poker or paying off vacation or paying off a down payment on a house. I think those are better incentivized goals for the average person. That being said, you need to understand that when you play poker for a profession, all the same rules apply, but the big difference is the responsibility factors completely change. So for example, like you should not be considering playing professionally at all if you have like $3,000 or $4,000 bankroll. It's not even responsible. You need to be able to, I tend to think, it depends on the player, but you need to be able to take money out of your bankroll. Think about that. You're taking money out of your bankroll to pay for expenses, and then you're also essentially, hopefully, moving up. And then you also need a comfort zone. You need to be able to fall down on it all. You could have a bad month. You could have a bad 2 months. And then all of a sudden you can't pay your bills. That's a problem. So what you need to always do when thinking about playing poker professionally is take into consideration how much money you want to make per month, right? Then also how much money you are required to actually live. And then you have to play with those absolute numbers. But first comes first. When you're ever thinking about playing poker professionally, the thing you always want to consider is reality of your situation. What's my hourly rate over how many hours? If you've been crushing poker, you play 2,000 hours of poker and your hourly rate has been, $45 or $55 at 2.5, and you have a bankroll of $35,000, of course we could have a crazy discussion about making you a professional player. Obviously, that's not impossible. But most people jump into this discussion without ever having any sort of real goal or they haven't accomplished anything previously, so they want to play poker professionally. If you want to be successful in this game, take it step by step by step by step. Okay, so if you're watching this video, what is the next step for you? First, now that you have a bigger theoretical understanding of how the answer to those 5 questions affects our bankroll, we can actually answer some questions. So if you have any specific questions, just click reply to the emails you are getting and tell us about your situation and ask away. Second, as long as you are playing live, no limit hold'em, we have a ton of resources and an entire curriculum designed to help you no matter where you are in your game. I'm going to be sending you an email with a ton of resources to help you where you are currently at, including our bankroll and poker performance tracking sheet and a link to some other workshops. Thanks for watching again. Any questions, please reach out and let us know.